Welcome to this special from Windows on the World. Welcome to Windows on the World. We're live now. And this show is going to be a fascinating one. We're going to be talking about people from the past, which ties into our previous shows about the Enlightenment, the great movers and shakers and thinkers, and above all, the interesting characters and great minds of the 1800s. And we're going to be talking about three people particularly. And one of them is Raimondo de Sangro. And he was a true alchemist, and it's now been proved. And we're going to also talk about Count Saint Germaine, a man who has had many legends written about him, but who actually existed and appeared out of nowhere in London and went on to be influential, especially in Europe with the monarchies and also with the aristocracy. We're also going to be talking about Alessandro Cagliostro. And all of these people were fascinating. The last one, Alessandro de Cagliostro, was actually derided by the Jesuits and the Roman Church and imprisoned. And that is something that is very important when we're talking about this period. We're talking Post Reformation. And what then happened was the people who were bringing new science into the arena and were trailblazing. Of course, we had the people who'd already translated the Bible. We'd had Wycliffe, we'd had Tyndale, we'd had the persecution of the heretics, which we covered in our film, The Heretics of London, the Smithfield Martyrs. But this, of course, went on all over Europe. And Europe was the strong Christian heart of development, which is why it was infiltrated and taken over. And the characters we're going to be talking about were the real movers and shakers of the time, amongst many more. But we're going to focus on these three: Count Saint Germaine, Alessandro Cagliostro, and Raimondo de Sangro. And of course, now we have the post-truth world. But then the world was being opened up. It was the time of the so-called Enlightenment, which was really, in the end, all about shutting things down and the beginning of empirical thought, getting away from the spiritual aspects, which the people that we're going to be talking about and have talked about were really all for. And this is the interesting thing, that a lot of these people who were denounced as heretics and, as I said, even imprisoned by the Jesuits and the Roman Church were trailblazers of their time. And they're the sort of people that I'd really want to meet now. What I find is that in the present, in this dumbed down, almost post-technocratic world, because the technocracy is already failing, we have this artificial intelligence which is never going to work. And so a new civilization needs to start rising from the ashes. And this is very, very important, because the people who have the ability to do this should have a moral duty to actually start advancing things and getting away from this self-absorbed, narcissistic, retarded worldview that is being imposed to control the world's population. So yes, we have the post-truth, post-fact world, and we're going back to the time of alchemy, the transformation of oneself. That's what these people were all about. They were working on a higher level. And that, in a way, is where God's providence seems to come in, because the information that these people were trying to put out has lasted down through the ages for those who want to find it. And of course, when people are derided and called con men and charlatans, then we have to take notice of them. That's happened recently, of course. I can give testament to that. The late Niels Axel Morner, the world's leading expert in sea levels, who contributed 3 times to the IPCC sea level chapter in their AR6 document. I think that was the last one that he worked on. Then he resigned because of their scientific fraud, their computer modeling, and their lying. All of a sudden, as soon as he resigned and told the truth, he was a Swede and someone who thought he had supernatural powers because he believed in dowsing. Never mentioned were the hundreds of papers that he'd put out and the expert information that he'd produced for 53 years on sea levels, one of the world's leading experts. So 1 minute you're a world leading expert, the next minute you're a charlatan. And that's the way this works. So when people are derided, it's always worth looking into them. So yes, the alchemy, the transformation of oneself, and these people had a concern with higher attainment, far from the materialistic dreariness of the establishments which were driving global tyranny, even at this particular time, of course, because we had the takeover through the bankers. This, of course, happened in Britain, the Bank of England. And when we go back and look at the French Revolution, all of the people we're going to be talking about were leading up to the French Revolution, some of them even involved. And that is really fascinating. So before the New Age, of course, before theosophy, before the one world Gaia religion, we had this search for an expansion of real consciousness through intellect, a mixture of the two. So now we have this dumbed down idea of science and spirituality, which is merely repeating garbage from so-called gurus and organizations professing enlightenment. Then it was slightly different. And in actual fact, I would have preferred to be alive then, or been able to time travel back at least, because these people were absolutely fascinating. And I hope you're going to think that too by the end of this show. So when being denounced as a heretic followed the Reformation into the Age of Enlightenment. That's one of the taglines for tonight. The main problem for innovators, of course, was the Roman cult and the Jesuits. Not only had the Roman Church tried to stop the Bible being available to be read freely, they clamped down on all thought and all published works which were outside the narrow corridor of accepted opinion. Online harms bill, pretty much the same at the time of the Inquisition. So yes, Raimondo de Sangro, 1710 to 1771, the Prince of San Severo, a true alchemist, and it's been proven. We're going to get into that. Count Saint Germaine, born May 1696, supposedly died 27th of February 1784, but we're not sure, because according to people at the time, he could even have been present at his own funeral. These people were really fascinating. Do you remember times when these sort of people existed? Well, actually, I do. I have met some of the most extraordinary people who seem to go in and out of different dimensions. And the idea of the dumbing down, the technocracy, the promotion of idiots like Elon Musk is to take us away from that, in my opinion, of course. But the Rosicrucians, Count Saint Germain, Louis Claude de Saint Martin, who was an initiate of Martinez de Pasquale and carried on the work of the Ellis Cohen, the elected priesthood of the universe, the self-elected priesthood of the universe. We've covered them quite a lot, but they were very important because this early Rosicrucian movement actually came out of the Reformation. It was a Christian movement infiltrated by Kabbalah not that much later. And of course, then we get MacGregor Mathers and we get all the people who went into this so-called Christian Kabbalah. And we've covered all that in previous shows. There's a great book by Bernard Pick called Kabbalah and Christianity, and that was published in 1913. And it gives a great arguments and information as to how and why Christianity, the original way, was watered down by an infiltrating force, which of course the earlier scenes talked about. They called it the demiurge, the archons, Yaldabaoth. They had Sophia, who was the divine energy of the earth, who'd been trapped. And the idea was that we were to be able to be free of all this. And in a way, that's what alchemy was. That's what the alchemy process was, the alchemical process was all about. So I'm going to give you a quote first from Alessandro Cagliostro, and he's also said to have been known as Giuseppe Balsamo, but that is meant to be a derogatory work, which was all about ruining his reputation. Because remember that once you are targeted by the Jesuits, they were very important, and the Jesuits were indeed set up to destroy the reformers. That was the whole purpose of them. The Jesuits were always an infiltrated and infiltration organization. So it's quite interesting when we look into that. But I'm going to give you a quote from him, and he's actually derided as a complete con man. But the thing is about Alessandro Cagliostro is that the things he said seem to go counter to that, and the achievements of his seem also to go counter to these allegations that he was a charlatan. And in the end, he was turned in by his wife to the Roman cult authorities because she took a bribe. So he was absolutely let down. And that is an interesting thing. He died in a castle in France, and he was in Italy. Italy, I'm getting ahead of myself here. I'm getting too excited because there's too much stuff going around in my head. Let's get back to one of his quotes. So he said, I belong to no epoch and no place outside time and space. My spiritual being lives its internal existence. And if I plunge into my consciousness and go back through the course of the ages, and if I take my spirit to a form of existence which is far away from the form that you perceive, then I become that which I desire. In other words, complete freedom from the material bindings of life. What we are dragged down with needs to be jettisoned. That's what he's saying. He says, consciously participating of the absolute being, I regulate my action according to the environment that surrounds me. That's an interesting one, because that's exactly what the early Rosicrucians were meant to do. They were meant to blend into their surroundings. And really, the idea of all this is that there are certain people who you can talk to and others who are profane that you should not speak to. And that is very, very true. Anyone who's lived through the past 5 years and the COVID agenda would attest to that. It's all about your neighbors snitching on you. And it was just the same then. In fact, it was worse during the times of the Inquisition. So he says, I regulate my action according to the environment that surrounds me. My name is the name of my function. Very important that people attached a lot to their names in those times. And that's something which, of course, went into the gematria, which was the Kabbalistic infiltration, which came in a little bit later after this. And my view is that this corrupted a lot of this early teaching. That is the conclusion that I've come to after looking into it over, God, how many years? A lot. And he says, my name is the name of my function, and I choose my name as well as my function because I am free. My country is the one in which I walk for the time being. Now, that is something which is so prescient today. Remember what they said? You will own nothing and be happy. Well, you can only be happy if you own nothing, because to know that you never actually own anything and that you are transient and you are passing through makes you free. And this is a very important thing about attachment to property and money. And that is, in a way, what they were saying. But conversely, these people we're talking about were not short of a few quid. They seem to have pots of money. But also, in one case, the latter case we're going to get into, he did also have enormous debts. So they own nothing and be happy. You own nothing. And those that get attached to money and material assets always lose them in the end, of course. So Cagliostro had this to say about his origin. I was not born from the flesh nor from the will of men. I was born of the Spirit. My name belongs to me. It is the name I chose to appear before you. This is the name I claim, the name I was called at birth, the one given to me in my youth, and the names by which I was known in other times and places. These I have abandoned like old clothes that are of no further use to me. Now, this may actually be a reference to his old name, but he's clothed it in something rather more profound, because according to his critics, he was actually born Giuseppe Balsamo in Palermo, and he was a street urchin, which actually to me makes him even more interesting. And he says, all human beings are my brothers, all countries are loved by me. I travel them so that everywhere spirit can come down and find a path to you. I ask the kings whose power I respect only hospitality in their countries, and when I receive it, I travel them, doing the greatest good possible around me, but I just pass. Am I a noble traveler? In each place I spend some time. I abandoned some parts of myself, wearing myself down, reducing myself at every stage, leaving you a little clarity, a little warmth, a little strength, until the moment at last when I will have definitely reached the end of my trajectory, the moment the rose will bloom on the cross. So here is referring to himself as Father R.C., Christian Rosenkreutz, and Lazarus, where the resurrection story seems to have come from in the Rosicrucian Fama Fraternitatis and their works. Of course, it was all taken over again by Max Heindel in 1909. So the Rosicrucian mystery is that many people have latched on to the name, but I'm particularly talking about the beginning of it. We're talking about the beginning of the Rosicrucians here. So what they became and what they are now is nothing to do with what they were then. And of course, we have this fake organization in America, which calls itself AMORC, AMORC. And there have been lots of incarnations. In fact, I was looking at a Rosicrucian website, and they hold Cagliostro in such high esteem because he is meant to have initiated people into his own Egyptian rite of Freemasonry. He's actually meant to have been initiated in the Great Pyramid, which may or may not be true. And I think the main point here is that we can take some of these claims with a pinch of salt, but these people, in my view, were actually really trying to transcend the mundane. And that's what we need now. We need that kind of new reformation, because the mundane is the trivia that people are attached to in their daily lives, the material progress which they deem to be important, which is of course of no importance. And I'm not saying that of course money's not important in this system, of course it is, but people who are focusing on holding property in this period of time and being able to carry on in a way that they prefer with their own blinkers on and hide from reality, they're the ones who aren't going to make it, in my view. And we talked about this on a show with Stephen and Evan Strong, that the fork in the road has actually come, and those that are not ready for it have pretty much already fallen by the wayside. And this is what I've found, that I've had to let go of more and more people from the past because they just haven't moved on. And that's what I find really exciting about this particular time personally, that there is time and there is the ability to have great attainment. And if you connect to the real inspiration that is there for you, then through God's inspiration, you can actually go to really higher levels. And that takes you away from all the technocratic nonsense and the promoted idiots that we see in front of us and what is happening as things are playing themselves out at this time. So I find that there is a connection to this need for a new reformation after the Reformation of the 1500s, after this era of so-called enlightenment in the 1700s. So I'm going to give you the contrary view, which is very popular, of Count Cagliostro, who initiated people into this Freemasonic rite, was meant to have been an Ellis Cohen. He was actually in touch with Martinez de Pasquale. And we did a good show on Louis Claude de Saint Martin, who turned his back on Freemasonry. We did that a few weeks ago. It's in the archive, a few shows back, leaving the Freemasonry forever, which is what Louis Claude de Saint Martin did when it started to restrict him. So we're talking here about people who had to have a place to meet away from infiltration because of the Roman cult, which had infiltrated everything. So the Rosicrucians were originally a reaction against this, an open public reaction, which was of course taken over. But in the beginning, it was all about the reformers. But this is the converse side of what people said about Count Cagliostro. Count Alessandro de Cagliostro was equal parts alchemist, Freemason, criminal, and con man. He's perhaps best known for his part in Marie Antoinette's infamous diamond necklace affair that helped to spark the French Revolution. Now, interesting, all the people we're going to talk about tonight were indirectly or directly involved in the French Revolution. And of course, Marie Antoinette was completely set up. She was exonerated. This necklace had been offered to Louis XV, I think. And it was during the time of Louis XVI that this necklace came up. It was worth 1.5 million then, which was quite a lot of money in those days, wasn't it? and Marie Antoinette was very aware that she was being pushed this necklace because it was a way of the infiltrators showing that she was part of the bourgeois, that she didn't care. This is where the "let them eat cake" quote came from. It was all taken out of context. She was completely innocent. She was exonerated in court of any involvement in the attainment of this diamond, which was being pushed on her by very shady characters. So in the end, we can see that what led up to the French Revolution was very much similar what happened to Tsar Nicholas and the Romanovs. Very, very similar. And indeed, we have stories that Count Saint Germaine was part of this toppling of Tsar Nicholas III. But again, we just don't know because he was such an enigmatic character. But getting back to Cagliostro, he was born Giuseppe Balsamo. Well, the Rosicrucians actually say he wasn't born Giuseppe Balsamo. He was born in 1743, though, in Palermo, in Italy. The Inquisition imprisoned Cagliostro in Rome's Castle of St. Angelo, accusing him of heresy, magic, and conjuring. This was, of course, the Jesuits. After an 18-month trial, the Inquisition sentenced him to death by hanging, but his sentence was later reduced by a sympathetic pope to life imprisonment, where he died in this castle, San Leo, near Montefeltro, in 1795, and he was only 52 years old. That's another thing about this particular period of time. People achieved an awful lot in a small amount of time. And now we have people at university for most of their lives after going to school, it seems, into middle age even, and in middle age even still living where their parents. I mean, even 15 years ago, this was never heard of. And even in the 1960s, people didn't do that. You know, this is kind of a new thing that people have been dumbed down, put in one place, been made dependent because they can't afford to actually even buy a property. But this is a really interesting point that these people, we have to remember, were quite privileged, or they put themselves into positions where they were with the privileged. So it says here, Cagliostro attempted a feeble escape from the castle, but was easily caught and overpowered. He was sent next to solitary confinement at the castle of San Leo, one of the strongest in Europe. And of course, died in 1795. But there's another side to this story, that he actually sneaked out of the castle of his own accord, and they let him out, and he went to heal people in the local village and to give them advice. You see, we have to be discriminating here, and we can't take one side or the other. But what's fascinating to me is the mercurial nature of these people. So if we go to philosophiaesoterica.com, we get the mystery of Alessandro Cagliostro, which is probably the most accurate and reliable website, because this is all about him and his family. So they say Alessandro was one of the main 18th century mystics. He was also misunderstood and persecuted until he died. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Or at least up to the moment when he mysteriously disappeared from his cell in an accessible prison belonging to the Vatican. So here we have another story that he escaped. He didn't die in San Leo Castle. Anyone who challenges organized ignorance becomes a target of attacks. According to the legend of Christian Gospels, Jesus Christ was condemned to the cross as a punishment for being a charlatan. Cagliostro is called a charlatan even today. So it was in Lyon in France in 1786 that he designed his Egyptian rite in Lyon, France, and it was the first lodge that was open to women. So we've got to remember that this was the early days, and of course Freemasonry played an absolute part in both the Russian and the French revolutions. So there was nothing good about it at all. But I think these people who we're talking about had noble intention. And when the French Revolution started in 1789, he was taken prisoner, tortured by the Catholic inquisitors to force him into confessing crimes he did not commit. And yes, he was condemned to death on the 7th of April, 1791, But as we know, he ended up in the castle. His books and some of his Masonic objects were burned in public on the Piazza della Minerva in Rome. So he was obviously quite influential. This is what they didn't want. They didn't want people who were talking about such thing as the alchemical transformation of oneself into something better. Because, of course, the canons of the Roman Church were imposing absolute dogma on the congregation. It says, because of his friendship with the Cardinal de Rohan, he was implicated in the scandal known as the affair of the diamond necklace, which we've just discussed. That was 1785 to 86. And consequently, he spent 9 months in the Bastille prison and was then banished from France. In 1789, he was arrested in Rome after his wife had denounced him to the Inquisition as a heretic, magician, conjurer, and Freemason. Well, there you go. He got betrayed by everybody. So then we get on to the connection with Count Saint Germaine. Cagliostro is meant to have initiated Saint Germaine into his Egyptian rite and into the Elis Cohen through Martinez de Pasquale. So this was quite a close-knit group. These people who were Rosicrucians, who were alchemists, seem to have been from a group where there was just a few people who knew each other, a kind of little hierarchy, with a lot of other people on the outside who were peripheral, but still part of it. People like John Dee, of course, had been involved in this, Francis Bacon. And of course, that's where we get Shakespeare from, the creation of Shakespeare. So this is a fascinating pre-imperialist, globalist kind of group before everything was taken over. And it still had one foot in a romanticized view of life and the elevation of the self, not through the ego, but through transmutation, through the purifying of the self, to actually be open to God's influence and to be in providence. So let's go to Count Germaine now. Count Saint Germaine, the Comte de Saint Germain. He was born on the 28th of May, 1696, and allegedly dies on the 27th of February, 1784. Appeared in 1743, in his early 40s in London, and he made a big impact. He spoke multiple languages. He arrived on the scene literally out of nowhere in his 40s, and he's said to have never aged. And there have been sightings of him after his death. Now, there's so much rubbish talked about Count Germaine because, of course, they can say he's still alive and he's still part of the Rosicrucians like Father R.C. But there are too many witnesses and people who knew him to actually say that he was a made-up character. He was a real person. He was known to the hierarchy, the people who were the movers and shakers, and he was adored by them as well. He was also a good friend of Casanova, and he was an excellent musician. He could play the violin. He could play many instruments. He spoke nearly all the European languages plus more. He was an alchemist. He was, as we say, rumored to be immortal, and he was in high society throughout Europe. And Saint Germain stated he was given the elixir of life by Cagliostro. So the reason that Saint Germain never aged, according to him, is because he was given the elixir of life by poor old Cagliostro, who allegedly died in the prison, being imprisoned by the Roman cult in Italy. So Cagliostro sought to regain true innocence of knowledge through knowledge, to go back to the original state before the fall of man through what was known as alchemy, the science and the spirit. So he was very influential, and to influence someone like Count Saint Germain, he must have been a top thinker. So I've got a load of notes here. I've actually started writing and putting things down in books as an aside. I'm buying these sort of books like this and A4 size books, because from years ago, I've just found all my old notes, and they're like an encyclopedia. And I used to make a lot of notes for the shows. And this is a bit of advice to people, actually. Always write things down. I'm not trying to give you advice. You probably know that. But there's so many people who don't do it. And it's really, really important. Not like just keeping a diary, but just putting down key points. And I'm finding it's really helping with absorbing a lot of the material for this sort of output. So the cover story with their Count Germaine is that his real name is completely unknown. He was a European adventurer who had interests and achievements in science, alchemy, philosophy, and the arts. He was married, but also kept a mistress. A question arises when looking him up on Google AI. This is really, really funny. Question that comes up when you put his name in to the Google AI. It says, is Count Saint Germain a time traveler? The answer is, as a time traveler, he has lived during the 1630s and possibly other eras, because according to some of the aristocracy, they remember him in the 1630s, way before he was born, of course. So if we go to Encyclopedia Britannica, of his real name or parentage and place of birth, nothing is definitely known. The common version is that he was a Portuguese Jew. He knew nearly all the European languages. He was a musical composer and a capable violinist. His knowledge of history was comprehensive, and his accomplishments as a chemist, on which he based his reputation, were in many ways considerable. He pretended to have a secret for removing flaws from diamonds and for transmuting metals. Now, actually, this may have been true, because he did have associations with people who were actually doing this. And we are going to get on to somebody who had already achieved this later in the show. And we're going to give you a peer-reviewed paper which actually states this to be the truth, because they've gone and found out. They've gone through what he actually did. This is called, of course, the Prince of Severo, who we're going to get onto a bit later. But it says Saint Germain is mentioned in a letter of Horace Walpole's as being in London around 1743 and as being arrested as a Jacobite spy and released. Now, that is corroborated all over the place, because obviously this fella come out of nowhere. He had all these connections and he seemed to have huge influence on what was going on, which is the most puzzling thing, because there's one thing being a socialite, and it's another thing having huge political influence. Now, years ago, I did know these ex-aristocrats. I say ex-aristocrats because most of them were potless. Some of them had investments, but most of them were what they say property rich and cash poor. But they did still have, or believe themselves to have, great influence within political spheres. Of course, that's greatly diminished now with the communitarian system that's been imposed, especially in the UK. But this is something I think that was very important at the time, because high society was much more influential in terms of political outcome in these times. Things weren't quite as tightly controlled, or didn't seem to be in this particular era. So, yes, I've got some information on that here about. Yeah, I think I can look it up on. Yeah. That's all right. Yeah, we can go into Saint Germain here. Oh, well, that's it. I've got the book. It's here. I've got the book. This is from another volume, and it's called the Encyclopedia of Mysteries. And it says the English writer Horace Walpole dismissed Saint Germain as an eccentric, but the great French writer Voltaire judged otherwise, describing him as a man who never dies and knows everything. So Voltaire describes Count Saint Germain as a man who never dies and knows everything. Well, that must have added to his legend quite considerably. So, on December the 9th, 1745, Horace Walpole wrote to Sir Horace Mann, two Horaces, stating that the other day they seized an odd man who goes by the name of Comte Saint Germain. He is said to have been in England for 2 years and had confessed that he was not passing under his real name, while refusing all information as to his origin and identity. Walpole acknowledged his great musical abilities, but testifies otherwise, that he was mad. So he was obviously quite eccentric. Now, this is interesting, because I always found, up until fairly recently, I'm going back in the last 20, 30 years, maybe a bit more even, because I've known eccentrics who were conventionally a bit mad to be very influential people. I mean, they're not going to be influential with people who think they're mad, obviously, but eccentric people have often been innovators and greatly admired in high society. So this is interesting what he says. He testifies otherwise that he was mad, but he's the only person that I know of who said that about Count Saint-Germain. It goes on, at the French court where he appeared about 1748, he exercised for a long time extraordinary influence and was employed on secret missions by Louis XV. Now, this is interesting. So maybe he was an agent. He could even have been a double agent. It says, having interfered in the dispute between Austria and France, he was compelled in June 1760, owing to the hostility of the Duc de Choiseul, to leave France for England. He appears to have resided in London for 1 or 2 years. Now, of course, this is after he appeared the first time in 1743 in London. And he was definitely in St. Petersburg in Russia in 1762. And it's asserted that he was to have played an important part in the conspiracy against Tsar Peter III in July of that year. Now, it's interesting because he's known as a time traveler, and he's also implicated in the Russian Revolution. It starts to get a little unbelievable. But when you have all these people that have testified that they met and saw him and knew him, then it takes on at least something that is of interest, takes on a whole new spectrum to be looked into. And that's why I find these people, not just him, very fascinating. He then went to Germany, where, according to the memoir authentique of adventurer the Count de Cagliostro, who we just mentioned, he was the founder of Freemasonry and initiated Cagliostro into that rite. Now, this is really interesting because some of the Rosicrucian material says it was kind of the other way round, that Cagliostro had actually been an early Rosicrucian. So this would have been the Rose Cross and Cagliostro's Egyptian rite. And Cagliostro was also an Ellis Cohen and also involved with Martinez de Pasquale and Louis Claude de Saint Martin, who we did a show on, as I said, a few weeks ago. And he was again in Paris from 1770 to 1774. And after frequenting several of the German courts, he took up his residence in Schleswig-Holstein, where he and Charles of Hesse pursued the study of secret sciences, probably meaning alchemy, the transmutation of base metals such as lead into gold, but the transmutation of ourselves into a higher level of being. He died probably in Schleswig in 1784, although he is said to have been seen in Paris in 1789. Let's go back now to what the internet says about Count Saint-Germain today. AI question: was he in the Order of the Rose Cross? Yes, according to some occult traditions, particularly within Rosicrucianism, Count Saint-Germain is identified with Christian Rosenkreutz, the legendary founder of the Rosicrucians, with some even claiming he was a founding member. So this source that this AI scraping tool has found is from the Rosicrucian websites. That's quite interesting. However, it carries on. This is a belief held by occultists like Rudolf Steiner and is considered a part of esoteric lore, not a historically verifiable fact, as the historical identity of Count Saint-Germain remains unknown. Then it goes on to esoteric belief. The identification of Count Saint-Germain as Christian Rosenkreutz is a belief within occult and New Age circles rather than a matter of mainstream historical fact. So now we're getting on to silliness, connecting with Christian Rosenkreutz, who was, it seems, a mythological figure, Father RC, who was dead and buried, and his tomb was rediscovered 140 years later by the brothers who'd reformed the Rose Cross. So that's in the Pharma Fraternitatis. You can download the Rose Cross documents on the free books page, windowsontheworld.net. So Count Saint Germain was held in high esteem, not only by the political elite, but by the social circles of London and Europe, by the Ellis Cohen, the Rosicrucians, the European aristocracy, and the thinkers of the Enlightenment, especially France and, of course, Germany. How could this person who came out of nowhere be so influential in world events? Well, it's almost like he was a time-traveling version of Marie Strong, and probably a slightly more charismatic version, even though Strong had a kind of demonic charisma to him in some ways. But he's a similar character when you think about it. Maurice Strong, who initiated the Rio Summit of '92, was leader of the World Economic Forum in 1972. He was a mover and shaker on levels that it's hard to imagine is possible. He became pretty much head of the United Nations Environmental Program, and he's the one who really started climate change as a controlling, governing system, along with Stephen Rockefeller and Edmund Rothschild, and of course, N.M. Rothschild in London, who brought out their carbon trading document for the world in 2008, the future of the new financial system. So when we think about it, Count Saint Germain was just as influential as someone like Maurice Strong in world events, which is quite incredible. But I think Count Saint Germain was probably much more interesting, talented, and obviously very, very popular with a lot of people because he could draw them in with his talent. Okay, so we can quote A.E. Waite. Now, A.E. Waite writes very broadly and flowery on a lot of things, and I find his stuff really hard to follow. I like straightforward, simplistic language, and he gets carried away a lot like these occult Freemasons always do, and they get involved in their own wordplay, but some of his stuff's very good. But A.E. Waite says that May 17, 1760, Saint Germain's second visit to England. The next time he was heard of is at Vienna, and from 1745 to 1746 with Prince Ferdinand von Lockowitz. So he was really getting around. If he was in London in 1743, and then he'd been to all of these places by 1770, quite incredible. First Minister of the Emperor, Ferdinand von Lockowitz, was his intimate friend. So how does somebody who comes out of completely nowhere all of a sudden get to rub shoulders with these sort of people? It's very intriguing. He became acquainted with the Mercurial de Belle-Isle, who persuaded him to accompany him on a visit to Paris. So then A.E. Waite does give his references, and the authority for this one is J. van Sipperstein, and it's the Historische Erinnerungen 1869, if you want to know. So by his own testimony, Saint Germain was in India for a second time in 1755. It would appear that he revisited Paris about 1757, and according to Madame de Genlis, her father was a great admirer of his skill in chemistry. So in April 15, 1758, he was writing to Frederick the Great, and Voltaire mentioned Saint Germain, who will probably have the honor of seeing your majesty in the course of 50 years. He is a man who never dies and knows everything. So Saint Germain is said to have been in Paris in 1761. 1763 he was at Brussels. These are all times when he was doing things within society, politically. And also it's reported that in a letter of Graf Karl Koblenz, that he was regarded as the most singular man whom he had ever seen. He affirms that he witnessed his transmutation of iron into a metal as beautiful as gold, his preparation and dyeing of skins, silk, wool, etc., all carried to an extraordinary degree of perfection, as also his composition of colors for painting. Casanova and Saint Germain were at Tournai at some time in the same year, and the story that Casanova gives is that at this time, Casanova says that Saint Germain was wearing a long beard and dressed as an Armenian. you've got to hand it to these people. They were at least interesting. It kind of brings back memories of people I used to know years and years ago in London, not quite on this legendary status level, but these sort of people I remember did exist. Crazy aristocratic types who had fallen from grace, often living in completely squalid conditions, but acting in a very elevated way and still exercising their intellect to the highest degree. And those are the sort of people I found and still find fascinating. Unfortunately, they're dying out, so we have to keep that alive. So between 1763 and 69, Saint Germain spent a year in Berlin, where he became acquainted with the Abbé Panetti, who was a considerable figure in Hermeticism and high-grade Masonry. So it seems that these Masonic lodges in Europe were welcoming all these people at this particular time. Now, of course, they were involved in such duplicitous and terrible stuff, especially the Grand Orient Lodge, that we can only say that it was taken over by this Kabbalistic influence, because these people were from and with the aristocracy, who, of course, derided when we look at what happened to Marie Antoinette, of course, and the French Revolution. So I could go on with this for ages about Saint Germain. There are so many sightings and so much corroboration. According to a letter of Baron von Wurmb, written on May 19, 1777, the Count was at that date between 60 and 70 years old. But people who witnessed him at the time said he never looked older than 45 or 50. The last authentic record is that of the Church Register of Eckernford, which has this entry: Count Saint Germain, deceased on February the 27th, buried on March the 2nd, 1784. He was also known as Weldon. He had an alias, Weldon. And it says on his grave and in the register, further information not known, privately deposited in this church. On April the 3rd, the mayor and council of the town certified that his effects had been legally sealed, that nothing had been ascertained as to the existence of a will, and that his creditors were called upon to come forward with their claim. On October the 14th, this was stated in the registered, and the result of this notice is unknown. So another enigma. So he never made a will. Nobody knows what happened to his estate, indeed, if he had one. So then we get to the sightings after his death. He was said to have been in attendance at the execution of Marie Antoinette, and on the day after the death of the Duc d'Enghien, in the month of January 1813, on the eve of the murder of the Duc de Berry. That was in 1820. So he was seen on the day after the death of the Duc d'Enghien in the month of 1813, and on the eve of the murder of the Duc de Berry in 1820. So the sightings were going on long after his death. On the basis of these statements, Saint Germain survived his recorded burial in Germany, but at least 36 years, by at least 36 years, and by as many more as we may choose to imagine after 1820. According to the AI-generated slop, he could still be alive. And the first sightings of him were in 1620. And there we're going to have to leave it, because we have to get on to the next important person in this show, because we've been going on 48 minutes already. I'm loving this. I hope you are too. I've made so many notes, and I think what's really important about this is to get things in perspective. When we're talking about those quotes from the early part of the show, I think that at the moment, before we move on, presently seeking illuminating discussion and depth of interest gets stalled and seems to stop before the conversation has a chance to even start. That's something I wrote down before this broadcast, something I've been thinking about. The cult of the trivial self has captured most minds. That's the point I made at the beginning. If one is not captured into selfism and trivia, it must surely be a duty there for you to expand the minefield and find the radar for higher level communication. That's what this is all about. That's what these people were actually doing. They were working on a very high level. And this is the really interesting thing that I found about these sort of mercurial people, is that once you make a leap, you get onto a different level of influence. And that influence may not be in having the masses following you, because that's never what it's about. It's about an influence that kicks into a higher level. In other words, a meeting of the minds on a much higher level. And that's what I think these people were doing. They were trying to find their way out of the materialist trap. And in this early stage before the Enlightenment, there was so many of these people. And this is what I found about this type of thinking. This is why I was attracted to it, because it takes you out of yourself and onto a much higher level. In other words, there is a vocation, there is something that needs to be done. And if you find what that is, things will accelerate, things will fall into place. Now, it's been ruined, of course, by the New Agers, because to them, it's all me, me, me. It's all about how they feel. It's all about feelings. It's nothing to do with the greater purpose, because once you forget about your limited self, the sky's the limit. And I think that's what interests me about all this stuff. So I think to make this point before we move on is very important. Higher level communication will come to those looking actively for it. Then it will become habitual. It's a little bit like when you're trained to do something. Your body gets physically used to doing something. It becomes easy to perform those sort of tasks. In other words, there needs to be a certain amount of repetition when you discipline yourself into a way of being. And I think that's what's missing in the present time. There's no mental discipline to get any further, and there's no aspiration to get any further. And there's a limit being put on people by the constant distractions of the slop that they are absorbing through what is called media. So these people were quite discriminating. So I've got so much stuff to go through here. We're going to get on to the real alchemist, the proven alchemist, Raimondo de Sangro, who lived 1710 to 1771, known as the title Prince of San Severo. Now, there is a paper known as Nuncius 39, published in 2024, and it's pages 451 to 485 at brill.com. And before we go into his achievements, let's have the background. The prince was educated at the Jesuits Collegio Romano, where Kircher's legacy of making magical instruments for both entertainment and functional purposes was strong. Isn't it ironic that he was trained at a Jesuit college and attacked and derided by the Jesuits, as all the people we've talked about tonight were? So the title of this paper, which came out in 2024, is In Search of the Phoenix in 18th Century Naples. Raimondo de Sangro, Nature Mimesis, which is not the impersonation of nature, but the taking on of nature. In other words, transcending the base properties of something and actually being able to create those properties. Nature mimesis, it's actually a real known thing, like an alchemical process, and the production of counterfeit stones between palingenesis, alchemy, art, and economy. That's the title of the paper. Raimondo de Sangro, Nature Mimesis, and the Production of Counterfeit Stones Between Palingenesis, Alchemy, Art, and Economy. This multidisciplinary article brings together approaches and methodologies of the history of science and mineralogy and presents innovative results obtained during two distinct surveys at the Museum Cappello San Severo. It focuses on the techniques Raimondo implemented to create the blue and red pigments which he used to adorn the family chapel, as well as on his choice to use fluorite as a sculptural material. Now, we're not just talking about somebody who painted things here. This is the ability to not only imitate the natural color of stones, such as lapis lazuli, but to create colors which existed outside of nature. And that's what this paper proves. He was able to absolutely imitate perfectly the properties of the colors of lapis lazuli and many other things within nature, which is actually really hard to do. I mean, making up paint out of crushed beetles and all this sort of stuff, of course, it was known at the time. But when they tested this, they thought that they were looking at lapis lazuli. They thought they were looking at certain gemstones. They weren't. They were looking at creations of Raimondo de Sangro, which is absolutely fascinating. So in a way, this was his physical manifestation of the alchemy, which he was trying to attain in what he called the Phoenix Room in his castle. These pigments became part of the object that they were infused into. It was found that the colors created to imitate nature penetrated, for instance, a whole piece of marble. Therefore, they were like a natural substance. So it wasn't like something that had been dyed. They actually took on the properties of something that seemed natural, a perfect imitation or pretty perfect imitation of the natural version of what they were trying to imitate. And of course, we have to remember that during this period, precious stones were a real sought after thing. People really wanted them. So there would have been quite a good market for people to make things which looked like lapis lazuli, which looked like gemstones, rubies, and so on. So this would have been quite a productive and financially rewarding thing also. But let's get back to this paper. It says, our analysis confirmed for the first time that the Prince of San Severo was able to create artificial ultramarine. As of today, this seems to be the earliest ever recorded example of the production of this artificial pigment. So when we're looking at these people who were loosely tied together through alchemy and through advancement of their own minds, we're looking at people who are actually brilliant inventors in their own right. All of the people we've talked about today were. It says, as of today, this seems to be the earliest ever recorded example of the production of the artificial pigment. Consequently, this study suggests that historical sources documenting de Sangro's experiences should be seriously reconsidered. Now, that is a really fascinating thing. This paper only came out last year. So what they're doing is they are really able to validate not only the claims that these people made, especially, of course, Sangro, but that they were actually involved in things which were way ahead of their time. So experiments were ongoing in the basement of his palace by 1752, and it was known as the Phoenix Room. Imitation of natural things was a way to gain knowledge of nature, for it required a direct experience with the causes of natural phenomena and a thorough understanding of surface effects and visual properties of the substance that was being reproduced. This is from the paper. The reason I'm reading all this out is because this is an academic peer-reviewed paper. Since the 16th century, the idea of mercurial mimesis had been meant to imitate these underlying causes rather than the effects of nature. In other words, to reproduce nature instead of copying it. So what he did was something that ran alongside the natural process of the creation of the original thing, which is real alchemy. It says, material mimesis required knowledge of nature in order to create materials that were barely distinguishable from the original ones, even though they did not exist in the world. This made mimesis a proper art of invention, a way to create a sort of hyper nature. But also the importance of possessing valuable stones at the time, as we've said, really prompted people to create them. But his main objective, Sangro's main objective, was his chapel of San Severo, which was his family chapel, where the evidence was found in the statues and the ornamentation within the chapel. So the samples that were taken by these scientists in 2024 were taken from the chapel at San Severo, which is the website we actually read from earlier on, which is, I would presume, part of the government official websites in Italy for people such as this. So the Roman Church article, The Sacred Congregation of the Index, placed a publication by Sangro as a heretical work. So again, he was denounced as a heretic. He wrote a book called Lettera, the Letter of Apology, Lettera Apologetica, and it was put on the list of prohibited books due to its highly controversial doctrine. I was unable to find a translation, so I can only give you an overview of what it was about. And according to the records, this book delves into unorthodox ideas about the origin of the world, free thought. Oh, see, nothing changes, does it? Online harms, people being arrested for Facebook posts. This is what the Jesuits and the Roman cult were doing in the 1700s. So the book delves into unorthodox ideas about the origin of the world, free thought and secret societies, citing many other forbidden authors. Its esoteric content and anti-church stance led the Congregation of the Index to ban it and declare it as a sink of heresy. So what was the Congregation of the Index? Well, it was a department of the Catholic Church created in 1571, tasked with researching and listing books that were deemed heretical or immoral in the Index Librorum Prohibitorium, the list of prohibited books. Its responsibilities included examining denounced books, deciding whether to prohibit them or require corrections, and updating the list until it was abolished in 1966. It was only that. So the Congregation of the Index of the Vatican to ban books was only abolished in 1966, and then, of course, well, Amazon took over. How many books have been abolished and marginalized on there? I know several. Well, many actually. We did a show on it about 10 years ago. Ironically, that show was removed from YouTube because it violated community rights or community standards. Remember, there's no such thing as community rights. There's only the rights of an individual within a community. So, also in 1751, Charles of Bourbon condemned the Neapolitan Masonic Lodge, whose Grand Master was none other than Raimondo de Sangro. Thirdly, he was not reappointed as a member of the deputation of the Royal Chapel of the Treasure of St. Gennaro after he reproduced the miracle of the liquefaction of the saint's blood. Now, this is not actually what he did. He was just accused of it. What he was trying to do was he was trying to transmute elements from a dead form to a life form. I suppose, stretching it, you could say that this had necromantic elements, which is why the church pounced on it. But in the AI world, it says rumors persisted that de Sangro could perform what seemed like magic, including replicating the miracle of St. Gennaro's blood liquefaction. But the reality of it was de Sangro's documented scientific and alchemical work focused on practical innovations such as we've said, mineral palingenesis, the creation minerals, experimenting with the rebirth or reproduction of minerals, which were miracles in a way, because this is the true alchemy. So he was also famous for artificial pigments, creating a true artificial ultramarine and other colors for adorning his family chapel. The Catholic inquisitors were busy denouncing anything that they could find at this time as a heresy, of course. At least during the last 20 years of his life, Raimondo made a great effort to search for the phoenix inside his laboratory. And what's interesting is he got sick of all the persecution and he locked himself away from the outside world and focused on doing this absolutely fantastic work, which has been validated in 2024 as being way ahead of its time and congruent with the creation of nature and natural minerals. So As the mythological bird turned to ashes, this is his website, the Italian website, which we quoted earlier, was reborn and completely renewed. The prince's goal was to unravel the mineral world and create something that did not exist in nature, which he did. They found colors there which hadn't actually existed in nature. Imitation stones, counterfeit gems, and peculiar chromatic effects, something that originally came from nature and eventually did not belong to it. Sorry, I'm fluffing a few words tonight. I've been a bit blocked up over the last couple of days. Something where nature was reflected, but which man's skills had perfected. He also liked the rumors that abounded that he was indeed a magician and an alchemist. He quite liked this. And of course, having a room in his castle called the Phoenix Room helped to expand his reputation. The prince contributed to spreading rumors throughout the city that he was an ingenious magician. Well, you can't really do that when you've got the Roman cult following you around. He loved the idea of being a bit of an alchemist, a bit of an inventor who could play in his laboratory by replicating natural phenomena, prolonging life, and even bringing back humans and animals from death. This, of course, I suppose, is where Mary Shelley got these ideas for Frankenstein, or Frankenstein's monster, because Frankenstein was the creator, not the monster, of course. Well, this is a fascinating time, and the amount of imagination and innovation that was going on then, I think it dwarfs what's happening now, because people have just got really lazy. And of course, it's the science now. Science hadn't been captured then. It was still heretical. Remember what happened to Galileo, of course. And all of this stuff that was being locked down and condemned later became truth. It became fact. And that is what's going to happen now, of course, with the agendas that are being imposed. They're falling apart. The agendas that are controlling the global narrative are actually falling apart, because if you build something on lies, eventually the truth comes to the surface. You can't do anything about that. They can't do anything about that. So it carries on here. It says he wanted the image of a Neapolitan Dr. Faust. It grew around him. It attracted attention both from the common people and the European elite. Yet it did not do justice to the several achievements he was credited for instance, in the field of stone imitation. So, furthermore, he counterfeited various types of gemstones, such as bloodstone, many kinds of agate, lapis lazuli, and others which replicated the hardness of their real counterparts. Incredible, that, isn't it? Because it was suggested that they looked as though they'd been created in a furnace, but they hadn't. One of his counterfeit stones was as white as ivory and as transparent and ductile as porcelain, and he managed to colour it both on the surface and in the inside. Like all of the aristocracy, he had debts, he'd inherited debts, and he created more debts and was arrested for hosting gambling events in his palace to pay off his debts. The French historian Pierre-Jean Grosly visited de Sangro in 1758, and one detail of his account demands particular attention. In a passage where he mentions Raimondo's blocks of white marble, which he had dyed red, he adds, "We saw a cardinal's hat so dyed," and you can see that in this article, or if you look him up, you can see him on that website. And we know he was telling the truth. Indeed, traces of red and pink, red or pink, stroke pink, are easily visible on St. Odysseus's cardinal hat in the family chapel, the one he was working on for so many years. The cushion is also dyed a bright blue, which shows that the marble was entirely coloured, not just on the surface. It went through and permeated the whole of the marble, so it became one with the object. This red colouring was also found on his tombstone, interestingly enough. Prince Raimondo, who's spending very little money, forged the lapis lazuli so well that it would fool any expert craftsman, even after being sawn into very thin strips. In this paste, one can clearly see the exact same gold stains as in real lapis lazuli. So it perfectly imitated the real basis of nature. Quite incredible. And it said it had the same hardness and weight as the original. Fantastic, isn't it? The paper states that indeed, after spectroscope analysis and testing the colors, they were the same as the natural ones and contained the same elements. This was found out by spectroscope analysis in 2024. The test proved that it is compatible with natural ultramarine lazurite, a mineral that gives the rock its blue color. The microsample was embedded in resin and prepared for both light and electron microscope observations. The light microscopic images of the sample reveal the presence of a golden and a red layer next to the blue. So, the same as in nature, but manufactured by Raimondo, true mimesis or mimogenesis. So, let's look at that word, mimesis. It's a basic theoretical principle in the creation of art. The word is Greek and means imitation, though in the sense of representation rather than copying. Plato and Aristotle spoke of mimesis as the representation of nature. So this paper concludes that this is a clear example of nature mimesis, as in the case of Raimondo's anatomical machines, the scientist employed natural minerals to create hypernature in the laboratory. At any rate, however refined the pigment may be, natural ultramarine will always contain traces of other mineral phases associated with lazurite. On the contrary, the most striking aspect of the blue pigment produced in Raimondo's Phoenix room is that it does not contain traces of other minerals. Its chemical composition, which is similar in all respects to that of lazurite, differs in the absence of certain constituent chemical elements such as sulfur, sodium, and calcium in particular. The latter is totally absent in the pigment composition, while it is present in the natural samples. So they did analysis of real lazurite and his lazurite. That's what they're saying. Underneath the artificial ultramarine, the analyses also identified a gold layer, which was intended to make the thin layer of blue pigment much brighter. Very clever, isn't it? And below, a bolus iron-rich red layer. So it was mixing these colors up, and it was showing exactly as nature does, like a rainbow effect in respect of the mixing of the colors. Analysis on the preparatory layer revealed the presence of gypsum. This may be the first ever recorded example of artificial ultramarine, predating Goethe's account of 1787 and the official synthesis of lazurite by Jean-Baptiste Germaine in 1828. So they also found that on this cardinal's hat, which is in the family tomb of Saint Odysseus, it was regarded the red pigment debris on the cardinal hat of Saint Odysseus' statue is still visible in the decoration margins analyses. And they showed that Francesco Corello used cinnabar, also known as vermilion, a mercury sulfide mineral widely employed in art. So the paper concludes that it is safe to assume that he aimed at imitating the vibrant scarlet red of cardinal vestments. Very, very clever stuff. This is not just imitating colors and painting things. This is on a level that is so advanced that this is what really drew me to talking about it. I hope you're finding it as interesting and fascinating as I am. And they also found a cushion on this statue of the Saint Odysseus statue. We also analysed the cushion of the statue because of its peculiar features. The cushion shows a strong blue fluorescence and appears to be an aggregate consisting of centimetre-sized fluorite clasts. Raman analysis confirmed the assumptions made from observing the appearance and fluorescence characteristics and identified the mineral as fluorite. One can see also green fluorescence due to residual organic matter between the fluorite casts. I don't want to bore you with too much of the technical stuff, but I think it's kind of important to get the point over to some degree. So Raimondo and his group of collaborators aimed at imitating and perfecting natural forms and at recreating natural processes in the laboratory. To Raimondo, reproducing lapis lazuli was not so different than regenerating river crabs or commissioning anatomical machines. From a practical standpoint, however, things were not as simple. It was all part of an esoteric and Masonic master plan, which the prince also wanted to encode in the family chapel project. So alongside all this, we have the esoteric stuff, which they really got into, and in a way is secondary to their own search for knowledge. Once we get into the Kabbalist nature of the Scottish Rite and the Grand Orient Rite, and what later went on with the Ellis Cohens, we're getting into much more restrictive territory, in my view. So, palingenesis was an alchemical process that reflected the introduction of the new initiates to a higher knowledge. So he was doing this along with his search for higher knowledge, not of himself, but of the universe and how it works through God. That's what was fascinating to me about these people. So the initiates to a higher knowledge wanted to rise from their own ashes like phoenixes. That's what the paper concludes. And there was a letter written in 1782 from Jean-Baptiste Villemoz, who was part of the Ellis Cohen, and he worked very closely with Jean-Claude de Saint Martin, who really took over from Martinez, that's Pasquale Martinez, who formed the Ellis Cohen. And these people said that Sangro was indeed an alchemist. So quite amazing stuff. I've got more here, but I can't really go into it. We've been going an hour and 15. I think the show is quite long enough, but I have loads of notes and lots of quotes about the accomplishments of this amazing person, and indeed the other people who were around at the time, because there were groups of these people and they were trying to do this under the radar of the newly formed Jesuits who were coming into power. That was obviously the late 1500s, but the actual infiltration was starting to take hold, which is why groups formed in Europe, and these Christian Post Reformation groups became these people who we're talking about here. So yes, there's plenty more I could tell you about Sangro, but we haven't got time. So in conclusion, the thinkers of the 1800s were innovators, educators, searching for wholeness and true alchemy, knowing oneself and knowing that knowledge is the gateway to enlightenment through God. Alchemy is the balancing of oneself with natural order. In other words, God's providence, coexisting perfectly with the natural world and becoming whole with it. Yes, the bigger picture, which eludes most, and is now so far away from the information field that it can only be identified by a few, those not distracted by self-importance and trivial distractions, as we see all around us, and as the people listening to this show know very well. So that is the ultimate transformation, getting beyond the self-imposed idea of me and identity. So I think it's good to close with a quote, and we'll have a quote or two maybe from, where are we? We'll go back to Alessandro de Cagliostro. All who wish to advance should sow and leave for others the harvesting of the crop. So indeed, it doesn't really matter what's going on around you. It's those that pick up on the information field which you are generating, which is important, which is why I think these people were so inspiring to me. So that was a trawl through some of the most interesting people I've come up with over the last couple of weeks from the 1700s, which I wanted to share in a show. Hope you're as enthusiastic about this as I am. And the reason that I take slightly longer to do these shows is because I'm working on things concurrently. And these shows take quite a long time to put together. I have to actually arrange them so that they make really good live episodes. And there's so much information in them. I want to make sure that these shows can be watched in years to come and will be good reference material. In other words, sowing the seeds and leaving them there. So I'll leave it there. And thanks to everybody who supports the show. And thanks for everyone listening tonight. And I'll be back soon on here. It's very inspiring to get emails from people and to receive information which is taking me further along. And as this is a lifelong learning project, which is mutual. And that is, to me, the idea of the new civilization. That's what it's all about. And that's what these people we're talking about tonight, in their own way, were all about. So thanks to everybody who tuned in, and I'll be back very soon.